Brother Luke up there. He has to get my attention. All right, is that better? All right, good. All right, so it's good to be here. We're going to start lesson 6. I think our guide calls it week 6. I think it's going to be a good study. And so I don't know if you all took the time this week to read through just one chapter, Job chapter 1. I'll be honest, it had been a while. It had been a while since I had read in the book of Job. But it's a good refresher. It's a good thing to look at. Because Job is one of the most honest books in the Bible, isn't it? I mean, the story that it tells, and just some of the things it shows us about human nature and friends, and what we're going to look at is tragedy. Our lesson title is Trusting in Times of Tragedy. And I meant to look at my concordance, but I took the word of some of the online concordance, and one of them was the Strong's, which I like to use. Looking at the name Job, and we're going to go ahead and share that, but one of the meanings for his name is persecuted. And another meaning for his name is hated. And another is the one who weeps. But I think the Hebrew is the persecuted definition for the name Job. And definitely, I'll tell you what, you talk about having a bad day. Job had a bad day. And, a lot of things can happen in a day's time. I look back in history, you think about 9/11. I remember that at work, they called everybody up to the front of the building, into the main break areas, and had it up on the TV screens. We were watching it live. When that second plane hit the towers, I mean, it was just a day of tragedy, wasn't it? A very, very hard day. The news. I mean, a lot of those folks that passed on that day, their families probably saw it took place because they were watching the news. And they would have known which flight that their family members were on. So, very, very tragic day. And I'm sure it still touches those homes today. And a lot that happened after that. When we went into war over that, even more tragedy came out of that one day. So one thing led to another, didn't it? So, there's tragedy, and it's a reality that we live in a world where tragic things happen. But I think as we go through the book of Job, or go through this lesson anyhow, we'll find out that tragedy doesn't have the final say. I think that's one of the great things about this book of Job. It's a good lesson in the life of an individual. Now, the book of Job is, if you read some writers, they'll say, well, some people think that this is an allegory, that it's just poetry, that it's just story, that's not a parable, but it's something that's to teach a great moral teaching. I'll have to look at it. I looked it up, but I'll share it because I want to share it, I guess, more accurately. So I did a screenshot, and I'll give you all one of the definitions. But an allegory is a story, poem, or piece of art where characters, settings, and events represent abstract ideas, moral qualities, or historical events. So I took this that somewhat to say, well, it's just a story. But it's not just a story. I believe Job was a real person. I believe Job had a real family. He lived in a real time. The time period in our lesson we'll talk about was, it's understood to be probably one of the earliest books written chronologically, right along the time frame of Genesis. During that period, Job was the high priest, you might say, for his own home. It was his place. He made the offerings, and we'll see that as we read chapter 1 here. He was the spiritual leader. He's the example of that in the home. So there's a lot, I think, in this book. But I do want to go to Job chapter 1. And I want us to take time to read through just that one chapter. And maybe if you're like me, I like to take sometimes and highlight a few things in my Bible, which I did. and have. I found out some other places when I used the book of Job, places I had highlighted also. But let's go to Job chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It says here, there was a man in the land of Uz, or Uz. And some of the things I want to, right off the bat, I highlighted. God is very specific, I believe, in this chapter in particular. He says that there was a man. And to me, that's a very specific statement. That tells me that this is a real individual. This is a true person. And it's going to be a specific things toward his life. So it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So we get a description of Job. It says, and there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. And that's a big statement, isn't it? And I know Brother Edillo, he would always say, he'd talk about all the camels and everything. He said those camels were the semi-trucks of the desert. So he had a whole fleet, didn't he? He was well-to-do. And, you know, some people say, well, that's a good status symbol for him. But, you know, God's given us a true and accurate description of him. And he had been very, very blessed in pretty much everything. And then in verse 4 it says, and his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them. So we see Job handling the role of the spiritual leader. He sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. So this wasn't just a haphazard thing that Job did. This was something that Job did on a daily basis. And if we're looking at the time frame around Genesis, I mean, Job may have, I don't know his lifespan, but may have had a pretty lengthy life. And I'm sure somebody has recorded that. I bet maybe Josephus, the historian, he may have recorded maybe his thoughts on the lifespan. Somebody may know that answer, but I don't. But I would imagine he had a fairly lengthy life. So we saw, first of all, in verse 1 that there was a man. I just thought it was interesting that there were certain things that were one of. It says in verse 6, it says, now there was a day. So again, I think God is being specific in his way. And we all, I think we can all kind of understand this because we have those days, don't we? You know, and Job had a day. I don't know, Brother Tim, I don't know how it affected you to get the news with your condition with your mouth. But I'm sure that was a day. And it kind of stands out. We get news sometimes we don't like. I've got some tests I've got to take, so I don't know what that news is going to be, so we'll see. So we all have things that happen. But he points out here, he says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And then he says, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, and it's interesting that he goes immediately to Satan, because he always knows that Satan is always up to no good, doesn't he? He knows he's always looking to cause problems. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Boy, that's a powerful statement, isn't it? But that lets me know that Satan is limited. He's not like God. He can't be everywhere at once. He's not omnipresent. And that's good, isn't it? But we know that, we understand, I believe that he has his demons, his angels that went with him. They can be in a lot of different places. And that's an interesting study in itself. Class, in a little Bible study, Bible college class on the occult. And it was interesting that, these crimes that take place. And they'll go to these people that are, I don't know what they call them, seers. But it's like they have information. Well, where do they get that information? Now, this was the way the class was taught. Well, who would have been present to have seen these things? Demons. That's who they're interacting with, is demons, to get these things, to get this information. So just a little side note, I thought that was interesting to know that. So he says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered and the Lord, and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, now notice what he says here. And the Lord puts Job right out there. He threw him under the bus, didn't he? Hey, have you looked at this guy over here? Have you looked at Job? Now, how would that make you feel? Job didn't know anything about it, did he? But he was going to. And it appears that's what the Lord has done. But the Lord knew, he knows Job just as well as he knows each one of us. And he knows how we react. He knows the beginning to the end. And he knew the whole story, I believe, of Job. But it says, and the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? And then the Lord, he gives some praise. Have the Lord say this about yourself. But he says, my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth. He says he's a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. So that's a big statement, isn't it? That he makes about Job there. Now, was Job, and our lesson will talk about this, was Job sinless? No. He was not sinless. So don't take it to be saying that. But he was someone that was complete. So he says in verse 9, Satan responds. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? He says, Hast not thou made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Boy, that tells me something right there. Job knows a lot or the devil knows a lot about us, doesn't he? He knows a lot about us. Think about that. If there's a spy, he's the number one spy. He knows the details, and he knew all about Job. But he wants to put some doubt on Job. He says in verse 11, but put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. That's a strong statement, isn't it? Put a little pressure on him. Take some things away from him, and then see how steadfast and perfect that he is. And so that's a test that we all face, isn't it? So I think that's why this is a good lesson. I'll say it is for me. How do we react to tragedy? What happens to our trust in times of tragedy? And I'll be the first to tell you that I've not always been perfect in that. Because things, boy, they will hit you just so sudden, so abrupt. And your reaction, sometimes it's not what you would want it to be. But it says, and the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So now we're going to see that there, verse 13, that phrase again, there was a day. Again. And we'll see that at least 4 times. There were at least 4 times, we'll see the 4 messengers that we'll see in verse 14. But there was a specific day again. It says, and there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger. The devil always has a messenger, doesn't he? He always is capable of getting the bad news out. You know, they say bad news travels fast, doesn't it? And boy, it does, doesn't it? It travels fast, especially nowadays with the technology that we have. You know, the things that's going on over in the Middle East, we can know those things within minutes. By the time it takes somebody to log on and send a signal out, we've got the news, we've got the message. But the devil, he sends these messengers. The messengers came, but came a messenger unto Job and said the oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And notice he says, and I only. And we'll see that phrase again. And I only am escaped alone to tell you thee. Then he says in verse 16, while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So he always has a messenger that just miraculously survives. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Do you think Job was having a bad day? He was having a very bad day, wasn't he? Have y'all ever had a day like that? I've had some bad days, but I don't think I've ever had one, I pray I don't, to have a day like that. But now, I mean, I believe this is actual events. This took place. This happened in the life of this man and his family. But then he says in verse 20, then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground. And what did he do? He worshiped. You remember what that little word worship means, don't you? It's a showing of worth, of value. And it shows us that even all the tragedy that Job was dealing with, that God was still just as much great value to Job as he was when he had everything. And that's a good thing to see, I think, in Job's life, in our life also, that God's value in his life did not change. He was still of the same worth. So he worshiped. In verse 21, and probably one of the most famous statements in the Bible, but it says, this is what Job said, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. He said, the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He says in verse 22, he says, in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. And I think that's one of the places that it is so easy to fall into that trap there in verse 22 that we see that Job has avoided. It says, and in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. And sometimes that's a reaction, I think, that will come. You know, we want to blame God. Why did you let this happen? You know, how could you, as a loving God, allow this to happen in my life? Now, I think that's just an honest reaction sometimes when tragedy takes place. But I think Job is a good example for us that's not what we should be doing, because God knew exactly what was going on with Job, didn't he? He knew the beginning of it. He knew the conversation that had taken place there with Satan. The conversation that Job had no idea that it had ever taken place. And I think I've shared this maybe in different ways, but if God would have put my name or your name in there, hast thou considered my servant? Well, Brother Bernard, we'll just put your name in there. Hast thou considered my servant Bernard? Hast thou considered my servant Tim? My servant Maggie? My servant Nina? What if that was God doing that? I don't know. Does He? Maybe He does. And I know God is wise. He knows who can handle what. So I think it's going to be a good study for us as we go through this. It's already been, I think, for me. But there in that verse 19, and he says, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. Thither the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I just put for a note for myself here that we see Job's mindset. He was not asking for or expecting more. Job had made up his mind, and his mind or his mindset was one of trusting the Lord. I don't believe he was really looking beyond that. He wasn't looking for a way of escape. He was realistic. This is my situation, and this is where my mind is. And I think that's something that he gained with time. We talked about how Paul, there in Philippians chapter 4, that he said he had learned some things. I think the same thing maybe happened with Job in his life. He had learned along the way in his life that he could trust the Lord. No matter what, no matter how big the events, he could trust the Lord. And I believe that's what he's doing there in that verse. So just some things from our lesson for the introduction. And I know we may not get far this morning, but we'll try to get moving along. But the book of Job could be thought of as the most depressing book in the Bible, except for the fact that it has a spectacular ending. And it does. So if you all want to cheat, you can. Just go ahead and read the very last chapter of the book of Job. You already have, I'm sure. But read it again. It turns out good, doesn't it? It turns out right. But did Job see that? He didn't see that, did he? And that's the same. That's the same way with us. We can't see the end, but we have to trust the Lord. He knows the end, and He knows it's going to be for His child. It's going to be fine. It won't be our idea or our thought, but it'll work out just the way the Lord would have it to work out. So it has that spectacular ending. We probably don't study, and this is very true, we probably don't study the book of Job as much as we should. And there's some I'm going to share some things I found very interesting. But we don't study the book of Job as much as we should. In one sense, it's a book that details the tragic suffering, but it also teaches us how to triumph through suffering. So just some of the things, the writers here, they talk about some of the preachers in the past. He says some of the preachers of the past spent significant time preaching from the book of Job. So it says 17th century Scottish preacher George Hutcheson. Now notice this. George Hutcheson preached 316 sermons from the book of Job. Man, he had a good congregation, didn't he? You're preaching on Job again this week? 300, imagine that though. So that tells me there's a lot in the book of Job. 316 messages. But that's not really enough. Joseph Carroll of London, and I don't know, I had to look these people up, but says he was later succeeded by John Owen. He says, now listen, he says he took 23 years. 23 years to preach through the book of Job. That's 424 sermons from Job. So I guess George Hutcheson, he just didn't do as well, did he? I mean, he only had 316. This guy, he had 424 sermons from Job, which were published on a massive, or as a massive 12-volume set. I'm going to look this set up because I want to know. I mean, I've got some books there. I've got a big, thick book, Albert Barnes, and it's my stars, the information he covers on Job. I mean, there's volumes that can be taken from this one book. So that's 424 sermons from Job, again, which were published as a massive 12-volume set. Yet, as he preached the last sermon, he said, I have not attained so clear an understanding of some passages. He still knew there was more that he didn't get. And that to me, that makes our Bible such a wonderful book that you can't just sit down and read it and say, okay, I got it. Because you can't. And I believe God reveals things to us a lot of times as we need them. How many of y'all still learning things when you read your Bible? And you've read it multiple times. And you'll read something and you think, I didn't know that. And I've read that. That's like Philippians 4:13, when I read that again and saw why Paul said what he said. I thought, wow. I mean, that's good. And it fit with our lesson. Trusting through trials was our last lesson. So it goes on to say that truly there is much to be gleaned from this book. Yet, like the suffering in our lives, this is a good point here, yet like the suffering in our lives, there is much that we can't fully understand. Is that true? And it is. If you've ever went through suffering and tragedy, you'll realize real quick, I don't understand. You know, you just have to say that, whether you say it out loud or you just say it within. But I will say, I don't understand. Why? I don't understand this. And maybe Job a little bit. He had to say that, why all this? You did this, and then allowed this, and then you allowed this. Maybe why, but it's an honest question. So we've already talked about the chronological order of Job. Our lesson talks about how it would be placed next to Genesis as the events occurred before or during the time of Abraham. And I'm just kind of hit the highlights. I know we didn't get far, but I think we will. As familiar as we may be with the what of the facts of Job, the why questions about the things that happened to Job, they still linger, don't they? And I don't know that we didn't, it wasn't answered there initially, was it? Other than God presents the character of Job, what kind of person he is. We don't have a true picture of the why. So I want to read this and we'll stop. But we too often encounter circumstances in our lives that we try to make sense of, but simply can't. And like Job, we're faced with some questions. What are we to do when there is seemingly no reason for suffering? How are we to trust in a God who allows this kind of suffering? I think these are questions that we'll answer. How can we trust in a God? And I don't mean that as a negative statement. I won't leave you with a negative statement. It's a good, honest question. How are we to trust in a God who allows this kind of suffering? And the key is allows, and I think another big key is whose we are. Who do we belong to? And so we're bought with a price. We're His. So we'll look at that. We'll go, Lord willing, next week. We'll look at the devotion of Job. Because I believe God wants to set the stage, and He wants us to fully see who Job was. Job was just a man. He was just a man that was trusting the Lord. He was following the Lord. So we'll go there, Lord willing, next week. Thank you all.